finalized all of my retopologizing and my UV mapping over in Maya, and I'm ready to bring the model back here into Blender so that I can begin the high-resolution sculpting. At this point, I wanted to give you a tour of the model so you can start to understand how I've put this together and really kind of see my construction process for this high-resolution and then more importantly, the texturing stage. At this point inside of our sculpting process, we're thinking about textures and how all of those textures are going to be created and applied on the model itself. If you look carefully here, I've separated the object and separated the sculpture into two separate objects. Let me just jump over into object mode here real fast. I have an object for the shell, and I also have an object for the body. Now, why did I separate these two apart from each other? Well, the first reason is utility. It's just easier to work with these things separated apart from each other. I can very quickly hide the body, work on the shell, and vice versa. These are two geometrically complex shapes. They're not intense, there's not a lot of polygons, but they are complex. They got a lot of moving parts and pieces on the inside. So being able to work with these independently is also a big benefit. The other huge benefit from this workflow is it allows me to separate them out into their own individual textures. And it's going to make it easier for me to manage those textures over inside of my texturing app, which is going to be Substance Painter. Having them both broken down into their own object allows me to apply a material, an individual material, to each one of these objects and control them independently throughout the production of the pipeline. Now, when it comes to the organization of the character rig, it also makes it a little bit easier for me to rig the body of the skeleton or the body of the turtle separately so I can infuse a skeleton in there without having to worry about the dependencies and the influence of all the skeletal joints being placed on top of the turtle shell. This shell then becomes a rigid object that I can constrain to the skeleton, and I'm ready to rock and roll. So it just gives me a lot of options. If everything was put onto one mesh object, it's just going to constrain what I'm able to do. And as I look down the production pipeline and begin to envision how this is going to be completed, having them separated just made a whole lot of sense. If we go into the body itself, there's some really interesting things in here. Let's jump into edit mode real fast. That will be helpful for you guys to see. So we got good topology across the entire system here. But if we examine how this is put together, I spent some great time ensuring that the body itself was all one connected piece, which is pretty cool. Now the nails, the claws, and yes, turtles have claws, which is pretty cool. The nails and the claws are all their own discontiguous eye lines, and I'll talk about why they're blue here in a second. So all of these are separated from the pack, and I have a very specific reason as to why I did that, and I'll talk about that here in a minute. In addition, the eye is also its own separate piece, and of course, naturally, there's two of them. This is a symmetrical model across the x-axis. Now let's talk about the claws and why these guys are on their own layer. And this is really about being able to control the sculpture. If you look very carefully down here, we have our polygons for our hand, and then of course the polygons for our nails. And these are discontiguous, so I can grab them, I can move them around, and you can see the illusion of the mesh breaking down pretty quickly. Now, the reason I did this is so that I can continue to sculpt a transition between the finger and the nail independently. Having them separated out like this allows the nail to be uninfluenced by my sculpting tools, and it will allow me to sculpt a much finer and just a much more controllable result between them. If these were all welded together, my brush would be in here, and then all of a sudden, whenever I'm working like right here on the mesh, I would also be brushing on the nail itself. The masking tools will help, but having them be separate discontiguous pieces is just going to make it a whole lot easier. I can assign them their own face sets, I can mask and hide, and just make it a real easy system for me to work with. It also generates UVs a little bit easier. I don't have to worry about those transitions there. It just makes it overall just a little bit smoother in the sequence. You're allowed to have discontiguous pieces inside your sculpture. It doesn't have to be all one piece when you retopologize it, but think through. Make sure the parts and pieces that are separate have a natural reason for their separation. The nails are a great example of that, as is the eye. If you look over here real carefully, the eye is, of course, its own natural piece. I did this intentionally so I can control the eye, I can rotate the eye, and then I can texture the eye a little bit more easily as well. It also allows me to continue to sculpt and deform the eye socket itself without having to worry about me messing up the primary shape of the eyeball. So, a couple little tricks here as to why it's looking the way it's looking. Okay, let me just recenter my view here. and we'll get to work. Okay, so one of the things that we see all the time when working in and out of our 3D apps is the hard and soft seams and edge tags flowing between all these different apps. If you notice up here at the beak of our turtle, and yes, turtles have beaks, which is pretty cool, I have a hard edge there. And the reason I did that, let's just jump over into object mode, is to stop the smoothing of all these polygons right at this edge. There's not, if you look geometrically here, it's just a single line, but because of that smoothing group, because that hard edge is stopping the smoothing system to conclude and start again when it reaches that edge, we get a real nice separation between all these points. And here inside of Blender, those hard edge tags are displayed as these blue lines. And I think what I did on accident is that I forgot to go in and remove all the hard edge tags on the objects for the nails. And it makes sense if you look real carefully. They're very faceted. You can see that the smoothing engine is smoothing each face of the nail independently, and it's not smoothing across. So let's fix it real fast. And this is a great little Blender trick. I'm just going to go in, select all the nails. And naturally, I would do this on all of them, but I'm just going to do them on a handful just real quickly. And then we can fix the problem by going into the Edge pull-down menu, and we're going to do Clear Sharp. So inside of Blender, it's not hard and soft, it's sharp. That's how we do it. And with all that turned off, we clear all the sharp edges from that object. Now our smoothing engine, yeah, it's smoothing across all the polygons, which is pretty cool. Now, if you compare and contrast that nail, which has not been adjusted, to that nail or those claws over there, you can see the big benefit of this, which is pretty neat. So I'd go back in and readjust all of those before I go any further. It's good to have the model prepped and ready to rock and roll. That way you're real confident with the foundation before you move on into the sculpting stage. Now the next thing that I like to do when I bring my model in is just go over into the UV editing workspace here in Blender. Now we're going to be making some adjustments to our sculpture. We're not kind of done with the sculpting of our base mesh yet. We're real close. The retopologizing process has given me a fantastic structure here for me to sculpt on top of, and I'm very pleased with the result that I've come up with. But I still have some additions, like the eye still needs some work, and I have some changes that I want to make in the legs, just to kind of plus this up a little bit and make it real solid. With the geometry and the topology structured the way it is, I'm able to make those changes real quickly. However, I've already UV mapped it, and this is just kind of a habit that I've gotten into. Whenever I retopologize, I just UV map real fast. That way I have them. The UV mapping tools inside of Maya are really good, and I want to make sure that I can access all of those UVs, and more importantly, the seams, in case I make a real big structural change to the model itself. If I really want to make a big change, well, I'm allowed to do that, but I don't want to lose all those seams. And the one thing that we need to mark real fast before we go any further are all the UV boundaries. I've UV mapped all this, and for example, here's the UVs for the face. I've activated and selected all the polygons, and in the UV editor, we're going to see any sort of selection, which is pretty cool. So I can select it, and all those UVs will show up, which is pretty great. And I want to go in, and just with my selection tool here real fast, I'm going to grab all of the UV islands. There we go. Wonderful. And what I want to do is that I want to get the boundary edges of all of my UV islands and mark them as UV seams here inside of Blender. And this is something that we should look to do. Those UV seams don't come across when we export from Maya. So we want to make sure that they're all preserved as best we can here inside of Blender. That way, if we need to unwrap any of this, it's ready to rock and roll. And of course, we can do that inside of the UV pull-down menu. And if you look real closely, we have an option here, a tool called Seams from Island. And let me just grab all of them real fast. There we go. Same thing, Seams from Islands. And once it runs the tools, it's going to go in, and it's going to find the boundaries of all the UV islands, which are naturally going to be the location of all of our texture seams. And it's going to create the UV seam tag on the model itself here in Blender. That way, if I need to go back in and re-UV a specific area, I don't have to go in and select all the edges and mark all the seams. All that hard work was done for us already when we originally UV mapped this over here in Maya. So here in Blender, with the seams tagged, we're ready to rock and roll. We can go in and very quickly make a change if we wanted to the UVs and not have to recreate all the seams. I'm pretty pleased with the location of all these seams. I don't necessarily want them to change, so having them marked inside of Maya is just a really great beginning. In addition, with all the seams tagged, you can see that Blender is now recognizing each one of these parts of the model as a separate object, which is pretty cool, or is a separate chunk, if you will. And that makes working with UVs and the rest of the mesh go a whole lot smoother. So I'm real happy with the progress that I've made inside of the sculpture here. It's a great little starting point, and hopefully this little tour kind of gets you into the thinking of how I set up the project in Maya, how I've brought it over here into Blender, and the few things that I need to do to make sure that this model is ready to rock and roll for the sculpting stage right here inside of Blender.